Welcome to Practical Parapsychology. Join your PhD host Drs. Brian Laith and Cindy Little as they arm you with the latest scientific research and know-how on ghostly phenomena. Brian is the lead author of the groundbreaking new book, Ghosted, Exploring the Haunting Reality of Paranormal Encounters, and Cindy is the proprietor of WacoGhost.com, a portal for professional investigations and public education on ghostly phenomena. Together, with their recurring guest, parapsychologist Dr. James Huran, they will take important steps with you to gain scientific answers about the nature of the paranormal experiences and the people who have them. For more information on practical parapsychology, visit their website at www.practicalparapsychology.com. Practical Parapsychology. The class is now in session.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Practical Parapsychology. I am Brian Laith here with Jim Huran. Say hi, Jim.
Hi, Jim.
Okay, good job. Unfortunately, Cindy Little couldn't be with us today. She was wearing a beret and saying something about leading a rebellion in Peru. I didn't ask questions, but she will be back with us next week. I thought that was better than the other joke I came up with, so we went with that
not
one.
Really.
Yeah, well, hey, I'm doing the best I can here.
Just stick to science. You're going to do much better.
Yeah, well, I'm waiting for Saturday Night Live to call. It's not going to happen.
No.
So we have reached episode 5, and guys, we are 3 days from Halloween. Ooh, spooky noises. So today we thought we'd go off the beaten path, and we're going to talk today about a very controversial topic. So I'm entitling today's episode, Things You Wanted to Know About Possession But Were Afraid to Ask. So we're going to be focusing today on possession, but you're going to see pretty quickly that we're going to kind of step back from, people spitting pea soup and screaming demon names to try and provide a little bit more context to this phenomena, which actually has a lot more context than what you might see just in American horror films, et cetera, et cetera. But before I quit rambling excessively, I do want to make the formal disclaimer that neither Jim or I are medical doctors, nor are we licensed PhD clinicians, right? So we're going to be discussing some diagnostic terms today. And talking a little bit about how people might look at possession if they were going to approach it from a purely medical or psychological model. But want to make it clear that if you think you're having trouble with this, or you're having odd symptoms, or this stuff rings a bell, we encourage you greatly to contact a professional and get the
Brian,
necessary
if I could
help.
just add one more note to that.
Sure.
And that is, look, let's face it, we're parapsychologists, and people that are tuning in, they're citizen scientists. So every day of the year is Halloween for them, right? And for us. And it can be very tempting when you hear about these kinds of cases to want to just dive head first. And out of all the kind of unexplained phenomena that you could try to tackle as a professional or as an amateur, this is probably the one area that you need to tread extremely lightly.
Yes.
And so I think we need to give a cautionary note. I don't want to say that kids don't try this at home, but this is one of those things that, this is where you're going to really want to read intently about things before you even start to think about taking a research step or two in this area.
You know what? And I'm going to add to that, and I'm glad you brought it up, Jim, because I would not claim to be an expert on possessions. I'm read, but the point is, I know I'm not an expert because I don't actually know who the expert is, and the literature over the years is very scattered in a lot of different directions. I've certainly had some personal experience with this stuff, but to add to what you were saying, this is probably the most psychologically disturbing stuff you can be around. It has, if you actually run into a situation like this, at whatever degree of quote unquote possession we're talking about, it is confusing. You have to worry about fraud. The person, depending on what's going on, may be mentally ill or violent. So this is not a situation that I'd say 99.9% of layperson groups should probably touch with a 10-foot pole, to be honest with you. If you happen to run into something like this, you need to reach out to educated professionals, formal professionals in mental health, at least for the backup and just to be safe. Or would you caveat that at all, Jim?
No, not at all. And I would say it goes just as much for professional parapsychologists. Unless you're trained in this area, which is extremely specialized, it can be intriguing to read about it, even fun in some ways. But this is not something you want to take lightly.
And I can certainly say from personal experience that it is a enveloping phenomena if you run into it in real life, and very hard for you to kind of keep your wits about you. It can become a very encompassing narrative, and again, there's risks there. So please be careful. Of course, we're
Now
probably
we've
not.
scared everybody off.
Yeah,
Now no one's going to want to even listen into this stuff. But I hope we've retained some people, because this is such a fascinating area. It really is diving into the rabbit hole, and it goes all sorts of directions, but it gets really deep really fast.
Oh yeah, deep and hard to navigate, frankly, in terms of making,
Yes.
in terms of making, like clean distinctions of what the hell is going on, right? It gets tricky very, very quick. So let's start with some basics, right? So the basics of possession. One of the core points we want to make off the bat is that possession is not limited to Western Judeo-Christian cultures, right? If you're a Westerner, or most of us are, right, and for a lot of listenership in Canada and the United States, we have been raised in either Protestant or Catholic, Western religious backgrounds. So everyone's familiar with The Exorcist. Everyone's familiar with possession occurs by a demon. But in a broader anthropological context, it's important to note that every major religion, and most subcultures, as well as subcultures, have equivalents of possession, right? It is not a uniquely Christian phenomena or Jewish phenomena or Islamic phenomena. It is a universal phenomena. In fact, a study in '76 actually showed that over 90% of the cultures they surveyed had some form of possession that occurs, spirit possession that occurs. Now, one of the core points about that is that spirit possession doesn't necessarily entail a demon, right? When we hear about these stories most often in the West, the spirit is malevolent, it's evil, it's bad, we're going to get you, pea soup, all that kind of stuff. But in many subcultures, the dead will possess the living. And there are several Eastern cultures where a disgruntled wife in a marriage may manifest an ancestor to exhibit.
Why are you looking at me when you say that?
If you want to get possessed by an ancestor and freak out, you by all means do so. I will happily
I wouldn't freak
document
out.
that.
I would like, great. Let's. I have some questions to ask. But you hit on a very good point, and that is you can think of possession phenomena as encompassing a wide range of things, but you can almost put them into 4 quadrants. There are, first, what possession actually is, right? There's voluntary and involuntary forms. There's cases where a person's inviting a spirit or an entity to come over them. And if it happens in good ways, you might think of that as channeling spirits or ancestors. In fact, we know from early societies that if you are someone that started to spontaneously feel connections with your ancestors, that was seen as a positive sign, and you were going to be a recruit to be a shaman. So that was seen as early talent that they could develop. So just because possession happens, it can be unexpected or involuntary, but it also can be expected and voluntary, and then it can be good or bad. So there is a lot of nuance here. So I'm glad that you were hitting on that, Brian.
Yeah, well, and in addition, not only are we talking about old shamanic cultures or religions in the East or Hinduism or other stuff, but I mean, even in, well, let's think about it this way. Modern Pentecostal practice does, right? Speaking in tongues, right?
Or being filled with the Holy Spirit.
Exactly.
Or all sorts of things where you're being consumed by, again, whether a spirit, an entity, a force, an agency that in this case is presumed to be good. But then again, there are cases where the malevolent forces also rear their ugly head.
Yeah, not so good, right? And worthy of note, most New Age practices, modern mediumship, as well as a lot of esoteric practices, all have very specific rituals for bringing a particular spirit into the body and manifesting it, right? So again, in the controlled zone, possession is rapidly popular and common. And it's also worth noting, right, that the other side of possession, particularly when we're dealing with involuntary possession, is true, right? Every major culture also has rituals for exorcism, right? So, no one has a toehold or a singular claim to, having the ability to remove evil spirits. In fact, all you have to do is really look cross-culturally at grimoires over the last 1,500 years, and you will find not only invocations, but banishings. And there are a few scholars that connect most of the Western magical grimoires for summoning directly to exorcism rites. So there's this weird interaction, right? Where not only is possession common, but exorcism is somehow also universally common and tied into what you might call occult leanings or rituals.
No, I love it. I love it. And I think we're also going to get into later on the fact that we're talking about contexts that are sort of religious, spiritual, transpersonal. But this notion of being possessed by an agency or a force that has maybe its own personality and intelligence, that happens also in secular contexts. So it's not just uniquely some sort of parapsychological thing necessarily. So it's a fascinating topic.
Oh yeah, and I would say probably generally falls more into what you would call an altered state of consciousness, which we're going to get into in more detail a little bit later on in the show. But yeah, again, one of the kind of themes in this first segment I really want to push with people is that we have a whole lot of culture over the last 40 years turning possession into, and I'm not trying to advocate it, be like everybody get possessed, but turning it into this involuntary, it's always a demon, call two priests, an old one and a young one, right? But in fact, it's a very broad cultural phenomena. And I think sometimes we as Westerners tend to forget that in broader, around the world where there's billions of people who don't look at the world like we do, that this stuff is happening too. And it's also dealt with, but sometimes its implications and the beliefs behind it are radically different.
Exactly. This stuff happens all the time, every day around the world. It's still happening.
Yeah.
So this is not something that you just see in Hollywood movies. And even though I think survey research shows that it's a comparatively rarer phenomena than other forms of altered states or anomalous experiences, it is one of the most dramatic. So,
but you are right in the sense that depending on the culture or the religion you're working with, what is deemed a possession versus what is not is a very radical thing. It's very much on a continuum. I personally, as a teenager, witnessed Pentecostals praying over a small baby because it had a demon of gas. And so they literally did prayers of exorcism until the baby, I don't know how to put this politely, passed gas. Right. Now, obviously, that's probably about the lightest version of possession you'd hear of. But you need to remember a lot of people that claim this stuff, the symptomology, which we're going to go more into detail about, is very much on a continuum in the sense that some Protestant religions and some cultures, right, would deem addiction or lustful thoughts, right, as the product of a demon and therefore worthy of an exorcism. Right. But then you can go, more down kind of the hardcore range to like the original case that The Exorcist was built off of, where, yeah, stuff is floating and there's all sorts of marks coming up on the body and there's, craziness going on, which is also deemed a possession. So, keep in mind as we talk about this, that depending on what group you're talking to, signs and symptoms of a possession will radically, kind of calm down or ratchet up, depending on kind of the world context you're in.
I'm ready to dive in after the break.
Yeah, and that's right. We were right about at break time. So we will be right back in a moment with Practical Parapsychology.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm having my morning coffee.
Beautiful Mind Coffee is delicious coffee your brain will love. Made with ethically sourced 100% Arabica coffee grown in the volcanic soil of the Tolima, Colombia region, Beautiful Mind Coffee is roasted and ground in small batches to ensure each bag contains a wonderful full-bodied artisan coffee. Beautiful Mind Coffee contains herbal ingredients to aid in boosting your daily mental clarity and focus. Maca root powder, green tea extract and American ginseng have all been selected for their ability to support good brain health. Taking care of your brain's health now can help delay or prevent the onset of cognitive dysfunction, including dementia, Alzheimer's, and more general memory loss as you get older just by enjoying the delicious flavor of our roasted coffee and herbal ingredients found exclusively in Beautiful Mind Coffee. For more information on Beautiful Mind Coffee, visit us online at www.beautifulmindcafe.com. Beautiful Mind Coffee is now available at amazon.ca.
Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Jim, before we start westernizing possession and start talking about psychological terms, I do want to make one more point and get your thought on it in that, again, a couple of case examples of how you can see possession in a different light, right? Depending on how you want to look at it or your cultural belief background. When we look at the Bell Witch history, right? You look back to the Bell Witch of Tennessee. You might, and sometimes pretty.
Explain that to people who may not realize that. Just give the general theme of what happened with that case and how that might relate to what we're talking about.
Well, oh, thanks. Fine. I'll give details and hopefully not mess these up. No, the Bell Witch case is probably one of the older documented. Some call it a poltergeist case, and I would kind of agree with that. But the entire time the case occurred over several years, it focused around one particular person and had a very active intelligence. And so, whereas and also applied massive degrees of physical abuse to the target victim. Right now, the difference is that in the Bell Witch case, you wouldn't necessarily speak through the principal target. Like they could actually hear voices, if you believe the accounts, from outside of her. But this thing would take over a body and beat it nearly senseless, depending on the situation. So one of the questions we would have is: was this family or person possessed by an entity, or was it a poltergeist case? Was it somewhere in between? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Jim? Do you have kind of an opinion on the Bell Witch?
The Bell Witch, in some ways, has a lot of parallels with another famous case that most people that are listening in have heard of, even though they may not know the official name of the case. But everyone has seen the movie called The Entity.
Okay.
Which was a case about, let's just say, a ghost that would physically attack and rape the focus person. This was based on a real case called the Doris Bither case from California. And while there's always been connections between certain ghost experiences and human sexuality, cases of outright assault, especially sexual assault, the way that was manifested in this case, beyond disturbing. But again, it was a case where a person was reporting being physically consumed by an outside agency, personality, or force. And while we are talking about the more extreme types of cases related to paranormal themes, this kind of stuff actually happens in non-paranormal contexts too. In fact, oftentimes it's a sign of creativity. I'm thinking here now of, there was a study done on fiction writers, and the ones that are the most prolific, they seem to not be in charge of their writing. They'll start a story, and then once they've developed a character, it's like that character takes over. And the author, that writer, is waiting to hear and take dictation from that character that's in whatever part of their mind that they're operating in. You also have glimpses of this from ancient history with the muses and being inspired either musically, artistically, aesthetically, by this outside force that consumes a person. Again, they're channeling this agency, whether deliberately or not, but the output is good. And so you get the bad, but then you also get the inspirational. And I guess that's what's actually so, in a way, frightening about all of this stuff, because even though it's probably in that same tangled ball of yarn, you never know what you're going to get with a case. And a case can start off very benign, just like a ghostly episode. And I know today's not about the survey of strange events and what have you, but even we know the sequence of events in a typical ghostly episode that happens spontaneously. Possession occurs in that hierarchy, in that sequence of events. It's rare. It comes at the most intense levels of a case. But this stuff manifests in all sorts of ways, and what seems to be a very benign form of possession certainly could take an ugly turn.
Yeah, and that makes me think of 2 points. One, in kind of esoteric literature, there is very much a separation between being obsessed versus being possessed, right? And that actually, now that you brought it up, does kind of parallel our SSE findings in the sense of, in investigation, sometimes they talk about, bringing a spirit back with you, right? Because you took an object home, et cetera, et cetera. And I will say for the record, I've seen that happen several times. That for whatever reason you want to explain it by is fine with me, but I think there's a real correlation there for some reason. But the point is, right, that the idea of possession is that the spirit or entity, if you want to think of it in that terms, is going to first attach to the individual and then manifest phenomena, right? Stage 1 is attaching to the individual and then wearing them down over time, which is the obsession, right? Until you get to the loss of voluntary motor function or loss of self, right? Which is where the possession occurs. And I can say, in personal experience and investigations and people giving reports, that pattern, if and when you run into like a temporary trance or a dissociative fugue or a possession, that tends to be the case. And I have certainly also seen in real life, for however you would prefer to explain it, people that have brought stuff home and had phenomena plague them for several months that seems to be of a negative nature. So I think that obsession versus possession dichotomy is probably a useful one.
It is, and sometimes I think it's hard to draw the line. I've been involved in a couple of cases now, where one was at the Edinburgh South Bridge Vaults, which I know you visited. I was part of a team that spent 2 weeks down in the vaults. This is back in 2001. I did this work part of my doctoral dissertation. And we were taking different people with different personality profiles through the vaults, having them record whatever weird experiences that they have. So we were trying to compare their experiences to their psychological structures, their personality profiles. And there certainly were some interesting patterns there that I won't go into. But I remember one particular instance. We're running through the experiments, and this was on a timed pattern. We were rotating people in, rotating people out. We were moving through 200 individuals over the course of 2 days. So it was a very intense set of experiments. But one of those sessions, there was a person that was standing inside one of the vaults, which is basically just this closed, small room. And these are very dated environments, very treacherous. You're talking like medieval times. And a person was standing in the middle of this room, staring at the back wall, and they wouldn't move. Their eyes were just fixated. They clearly were watching something, or they seemed absorbed, immersed in something. So you don't know whether they were grabbing something or something was grabbing them, so to speak, in terms of their attention or what have you. But that person, it took a lot to get them to finally, if you want to say, wake up, snap out of it, where they can then go on and finish the experiment. And I've seen this also happen in a very negative way. That was very benign. There was nothing traumatic about that experience. But I was doing a field study in 2007 where we were examining a haunted residence as well as a control residence right next door. And it was fascinating, as this was a case that was an active haunt/poltergeist episode. Now, I'm someone that believes that there's no hard and fast distinction between a haunt and a poltergeist. So they have mixtures of both. But in this case, it was a couple, an older couple, that agreed to allow us to come in to run a set of experiments, both physical equipment as well as some witnesses, something similar to what we did in Scotland at the South Bridge Vaults. And we had just finished doing the environmental measures. No people had come through. And the man, the guy who was in the couple that was a house owner, I didn't deal too much with him. I had met with him before. His wife was someone that I knew quite well, and she was the one that invited the study and got him on board, or so we thought. Because on that day, we did the environmental stuff and everything was fine. But about an hour before people were supposed to show up, we could take them through a similar exercise. His mood switched. Instantly. Never seen anything like this. This was outside. This wasn't even inside the house. This was on a driveway where he was polite at first, and then he just completely changes personality, like a Jekyll Hyde situation, and he starts screaming. He starts screaming at me and the other people that were there running the proceedings, saying, "You're going to upset it. This is making it worse. You all need to leave. This has to stop." And it was bad. It caused a very public scene. Obviously, we stopped the proceedings. We didn't bring people in. We respected, obviously, this couple. But later, I connected with the lady that I knew and her husband, and he doesn't remember any of that. He remembers that we stopped the study, but he doesn't remember snapping. He doesn't remember what he said. I have to take him at his word. But this notion of being possessed or becoming obsessed in the moment, whether it's benign or dramatic, I've seen this in the course of actual investigations. And I think you've also had similar experiences.
Yeah, honestly, it's funny you bring that up because, and I'm going to be purposefully mysterious here. I'm not going to name the place I'm talking about because honestly, I don't think it's safe. But we did a series of 4 investigations at a location, and there were 2 instances. In the second and the third time, both people that I knew very, very well for no reason whatsoever, entered into, to use formal parlance, some sort of dissociative fugue state, like you were describing. They became intensely angry. They would not respond to questions. It happened out of nowhere. They were staring at a wall. And these people were so angry and confused, they were not only a violence risk, but they basically roamed out of the location into the street. I literally had to go after both of these people on separate occasions. And we had to kind of shake them out of it. And they basically came out of it roughly, if they got about a block away from the location. But they were fundamentally disturbed. They had little memory of what they had done. They were very, very hostile and angry at people that they had known and worked with for years.
Now, see, that is a great point, because the two instances that I talked about, these were people that were sort of unsuspecting participants. They weren't parapsychologists, they weren't citizen scientists, they really didn't have any long-standing interest in paranormal tourism or legend tripping. But what you're talking about is this stuff can even happen to experienced field investigators.
Oh yeah, I mean, we literally had been running a scientific lab grade shop for 6 years with some of these people, and they had just turned into completely different people. And when coming out of it, they would be like, "I was so angry, I was literally thinking about killing you." Like, I mean, and they meant it, they meant it dead serious. And one of them even looked at me and said, "The spirit told me it's coming for you next." How's that for like a, you're like, "Oh,
well, the fact that you can say that and smile. Well, you're here with us now, so that's good news. But you know what? I mean, you've used a couple terms now: emotion, dissociative, fugue. After this next break, I want to dive into that, because psychology does know about some phenomena that certainly resemble possession-like states that can happen to even normal people under very interesting circumstances, and there might be some relevance to what we're talking about today.
Yeah. Oh, look at that. We are full of teasers this episode. We're doing all kinds of like coming up soon, right? Yeah.
That's right.
We are on it. All right. Well, you know what? We will go ahead and take another brief break, and we'll be back with Practical Parapsychology in just a moment.
So I was watching the X Zone TV channel last night when I was abducted by aliens, and they kept repeating to me over and over again, simultv.com, simultv.com.
What's simultv.com?
That's what I asked them. They had it written on the side of their UFO.
How do you spell that?
UFO.
No, I mean simultv.com.
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 Right. simultv.com.
Interesting that you were abducted by aliens in a simultv.com UFO last night.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Now that you mention it, I remember now last night I was awakened from a deep sleep. My great-grandmother was standing there. She said she'd come from the hereafter to tell me about simultv.com. She even spelled it out for me.
simultv.com, sonny boy.
simultv.com.
simultv.com, sonny boy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Guys, you'll never guess what my psychic guru just told me.
simultv.com.
Exactly. Are you guys psychic too?
Of course.
We all know about simultv.com. simultv.com.
Welcome back, everyone. Okay, so let's get into westernizing possession. And
that's not fair. Now, that's not entirely fair. I mean, you make it sound as if people like me, the skeptic, are trying to dismiss these things, and that's not the case. Not at all. At least for me.
I would expect that from a Western oppressive materialist who is all about empire.
Is that how you see it? Okay.
No, not really.
Well, guess who's not getting a Christmas card this year? Okay.
Fine.
No, but there really are documented phenomena that are known within conventional psychology that certainly look a lot like possession states. In fact, it's another form of it, if you want to think of it that way. You've used the phrase dissociation. Yes. Can I challenge you to describe for everyone in very simple terms, what do you mean by dissociation? Don't give me the psychological jargon. Give me the everyday elevator speech.
Okay, so that is more of a challenge, because I had a formal definition, but now you're going to make me kind of do it in a practical.
Oh, in other words, you were going to give a westernized answer.
Hey, back off, oppressor. No, so one way I've always thought about dissociation in practical lay terms, right? First of all, understand, guys, it's a trait that everybody has to a lesser or a greater degree. And I think maybe an actual real life example might be the easiest way to define it. I did a brief stint, and I am an introvert, by the way, guys. And if you're not familiar with that, I'm a person that's not a fan of a whole lot of stimulus and crowds. That doesn't work too well with my nature. But I decided to be a bartender when I was 21. And I discovered as mobs of people would come and ask for drinks that suddenly I was becoming less and less aware of what was going on around me, almost as if I was watching myself kind of engage in the actions of making a screwdriver, or telling some lady that was with the band that she couldn't have a free drink, that that I wasn't all there, that I was like becoming kind of foggy or detached. And Jimmy would probably agree with me. That is a mild degree of what you might call dissociation. It's when we detach from our conscious selves, and in some ways go inward,
exactly.
so to speak.
Now, people, when they hear of that phrase dissociation, they may immediately go to the most exotic, dramatic examples, like when you saw with stories like The Three Faces of Eve or Sybil, where you go to this thing that they would call multiple personality disorder, right? Where a person would literally dissociate themselves into other people. And while there is a dissociative identity disorder, DID, that is a legitimate clinical diagnosis, that is rare. It's not like that happens every day. And when it does happen, we know that there are certain circumstances that usually involve trauma or abuse. It's a coping mechanism to help a person dissociate from terrible memories, maybe even muscle memory. But it's a way to sort of cope with tragedy, loss, trauma.
So let me be the APA for a moment and basically break down the DSM so everybody's kind of clear on this, and we can say, oh, look, we did our education for the day. All right, so dissociative, there's a whole class of disorders, guys, that clinicians can diagnose called dissociative disorders, right? And before the DSM-4, it used to be called multiple personality disorder, right? And that's where, if you've seen in the movies, the person, kind of looks funny and suddenly becomes like a 50-year-old grandmother from another world, even though they're a male, right? And the gist of the disorder is that a person dissociates to the point that other personalities within the unconscious manifest and take over. And very often, if you believe in the official version of multiple personality, the primary personality is not aware of the alternate personalities that'll manifest. So they will report blacking out, right? And that's kind of the dissociative component. They will go away while the other personality comes and manifests itself. Although if you look into some of these cases, the alternate personalities that manifest can talk to each other. It's usually the primary person, like the primary personality, that blacks out. Well, around 94, they renamed it dissociative identity disorder. It's the same disorder with a fancy new title, right? So, there's a lot of people out there that think that, possession cases are simply manifestations of dissociative identity disorder, a manifestation of a person unconsciously bringing forth an other personality, right, while their core personality blacks out. And then that's kind of a simplified explanation, but that's kind of the gist of it. But Jim is absolutely right. One of the things you find with multiple personality, or from this point forward, we'll say dissociative identity disorder, DID, is that yes, there is a ridiculously high history of highly traumatic physical and sexual abuse very often in childhood. About the only other place you tend to see that degree of abuse is with certain personality disorders, where it predicts childhood abuse very strongly, and in a lot of cases, bipolar disorder. Not that they're the same thing. They're not, but that abuse connection is often very common. And the theory is that the extreme abuse in childhood caused them to dissociate to the point that they went inside themselves and started to create alternate personalities to cope with the abuse. So kind of a go inside and avoid, right? Avoid the trauma.
Or go outside and avoid what's happening, in the case of a physical assault. If you remove yourself from your body, at least mentally, you're putting distance there. You're at least fleeing in a way from the situation. But fascinating. There clearly are documented cases of this happening. And of course, there have also been times where supposed cases of DID have been exaggerated. But there is something interesting about just dissociation. It's not as if there's one form, and it's that you become multiple personalities or not. There's a spectrum of phenomena that sort of build in intensity. And there's 3 particular categories that people should be aware of. In fact, you can stimulate these in people given the right set of circumstances. One of those is the classic setup of what we call mirror gazing or eye gazing. In clinical terms, you might know this as psychomantiums, where a person is sitting in a room with low light and they're staring into a mirror. Or you are in a room where you're sitting across from another person like me and Brian right now, and you stare into the other person's eyes. And after a few minutes, you'll start noticing some things. First, you'll have a sense of derealization, where you are not so much connected anymore to just normal reality. Your sense of time is off. Your sense of bodily sensations is off. You start disconnecting your sensations from the world. Then it starts going into something called depersonalization, where you start separating from your body. People might report as if they're having an out-of-body experience, or they're seeing their body from different points of view, but very weird. And the most extreme is where we call dissociative identity or dissociated identity, where you start seeing now faces of other people, entities. You might start hearing voices coming out of the mirror or coming out of that other person's face. So we all have in ourselves the capacity to bring forth, if you want to say, other identities, other agencies, other motivations, or maybe that's just simply letting out what was already there in a very conscious way. Sigmund Freud would love that, by the way, right?
Yes,
the other parts
absolutely.
of your unconscious coming to life and having their chance at the outside world versus us filtering them. But dissociative phenomena happens different intensities in different forms, and several of those forms certainly resemble possession-like states.
Yeah, well, and you make another powerful point, which is, dissociation ability, whether it's measured as absorption or indirectly through transliminality, it is a trait that varies among the population in general. Everyone can dissociate to a lesser or a greater degree, but some people are better at it than others. Some people have a greater ability towards it than others.
Absolutely. But I would say it's not just a trait, meaning it's with us all the time. It's just an ability, an innate characteristic people have. But it's also what we call a state variable, meaning under certain settings or conditions, what is already there can be dialed up or it can be dialed down. Most people have been into a hypnotic trance, whether they realize it or not. Falling in love is like a hypnotic trance. So is watching a movie, where you become so absorbed in the movie that you forget you're watching a movie. You get so invested, so emotional. You've experienced a sense of trance, a sense of dissociation. Yep. So it is something that we all have, and given the circumstances, we could ratchet it up or dial it down. And it makes you wonder, to what extent, when you hear cases of possession like we've described during the course of haunt research, field studies, or these cases of what they call diabolical possession, which is what most people think of when they hear possession, demonic possession. An evil spirit is now taking over involuntarily your body and your mind. These same mechanisms that relate to dissociation very well might play into these things too.
And that's why I quit looking you in the eyes, Jim, a long time ago, because every time I do it, I start hearing voices telling me to eat devil's food cake. So I got tired of it.
That's just me practicing ventriloquism, but still, I'm glad you're listening.
Good to know. Good to know. Very good to know. Thank you. I feel better about that. Hey, a quick test for listeners at home, by no means a scientific test. If you're a person that reads a book, but you no longer notice what's going on around you, or if you're watching a television show, and people can walk past the room or ask you questions and you don't hear them, you're engaging in low levels of dissociation. You're detaching from yourself. If you're a person, when reading a book, it turns into a movie in your head. I would say that there's a good chance that you're, moderately good at dissociative ability. It happens all the time around us all the time. Some would even say, to a certain extent, daydreaming. If you're not listening closely to our podcast, for instance, or if you're in a lecture.
What? Was it last point? What?
I'm looking in your eyes again. Oh God, stop the voices. Great. Anyway. But let me turn this around a little bit, Jim, because jokes aside about Western oppression, do you believe that the current diagnosis of DID is understood sufficiently to, as the skeptic, really completely account for all of these possession cases. What's your take about the degree to which a medical model, where it's all in the brain or it's all psychological and in your head, accounts for this variety of experiences?
Well, I'm an equal opportunity offender and skeptic, so I would say we don't know enough about just dissociative ability, let alone the more extreme versions of it, and we don't know enough about possession cases of the kind that we're talking about. They're so rare. And usually if you can research one, it's after the fact. It's not as if it's ongoing. So I don't think we have enough data to make any strong, correlations. There just seem to be some interesting correspondences between the way that dissociation expresses itself clinically, as well as sort of the mannerisms and the look and feel of these more extreme possession cases, whether they're channeling of spirits or loved ones, or whether it's a diabolical possession. But I do think, though, it's not random who has possession experiences. And I do think that a person's makeup probably helps facilitate or put up a barrier to whatever that ultimate catalyst is. That's my sense.
Okay. No, that's not bad.
But after this next break, I do have a huge caveat. There is a huge asterisk with a little footnote that you need to hear.
Okay. All right. Well, I would make the point since we are talking about dissociative identity disorder, I do also want to make it clear that the majority of DID cases are not cases where people are claiming that the devil is inside them. Like, that is not, in other words, it's not like, oh, it's a possession. No. We call it dissociative identity. That's not the devil. With people who have DID, they can report anywhere from 5 to 40 or more separate personalities, but they're not always religious figures or demons or spirits. In fact, a lot of them are just, sometimes they're objects. Sometimes people have tree personalities. But it's also worth noting that, there are a branch of clinicians that do not believe that dissociative identity disorder is a legitimate disorder. In fact, and I never say this right, iatrogenic or iatrogenic. Do you know the difference? Which one is it, Jim? Do you know?
No.
Okay, well,
this is a good case of sometimes psychologists have too much time on their hand. I should say social scientists, and they just keep inventing labels for things.
Well, I do like to do that.
All we can say is it's factitious, meaning there's all sorts of reasons why someone might make up that kind of sign or a symptom for gain, whether it's sympathy, money, or what have you.
Well, and the anti-DID group basically are making the claim that a therapist under conditions of vulnerability with a client is unconsciously suggesting to a person that they have DID or that there is an alternate personality, and through a process of hypnosis or through suggestive states is basically creating the disorder on the couch in therapy. And I don't know who is right with regards to that debate, and I don't know if they've ever resolved it. But it's probably good for the listenership to know that not every clinical psychologist or person in the APA agrees that DID is a fully legitimate disorder. That's probably a fair statement to make, right?
That's very fair, very responsible.
Look at me, that for a change, being responsible. Okay.
Don't get a big head.
Well, I'm trying. So we are getting close to the break, I believe.
I think we should take another break, and then I wanna tell a story. It's a true story, happened to me, that I think gives a little further color commentary to what is happening with these things and why we should be careful.
Okay, so coming up next on Practical Parapsychology, Jimmy tells a Halloween story.
It's Jim, and it's Dr. Jim.
We'll be right back, folks.
Beautiful Mind Coffee is delicious coffee your brain will love. Made with ethically sourced 100% Arabica coffee grown in the volcanic soil of the Tolima, Colombia region, Beautiful Mind Coffee is roasted and ground in small batches to ensure each bag contains a wonderful full-bodied artisan coffee. Beautiful Mind Coffee contains herbal ingredients to aid in boosting your daily mental clarity and focus. Maca root powder, green tea extract and American ginseng have all been selected for their ability to support good brain health. Taking care of your brain's health now can help delay or prevent the onset of cognitive dysfunction, including dementia, Alzheimer's, and more general memory loss as you get older just by enjoying the delicious flavor of our roasted coffee and herbal ingredients found exclusively in Beautiful Mind Coffee. For more information on Beautiful Mind Coffee, visit us online at www.beautifulmindcafe.com. Beautiful Mind Coffee is now available at amazon.ca.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. And as I alluded to before, now Dr. Jim Horan will tell us a story. See, look at that. Respectful.
Excellent. I like that. I like that. So first, speaking of teasers, though, next year, early next year, we're going to do a special issue of the Journal of Scientific Exploration. And the theme is going to be the darker side of spirituality. And one of the articles is going to be a review of what we know scientifically about diabolical possession. When does it happen? Under what context? What kind of people? So when that issue comes out, Brian, we really should bring on some of those authors and kind of do a deep dive into some of these more esoteric but really underappreciated aspects of spirituality. There's some really cool stuff out there that makes you go, And one of them is diabolical possession or demonic possession.
Yeah.
So here's the story. I've always obviously been interested in unexplained phenomena, but especially of a religious nature. And let's face it, as a young kid, I saw The Exorcist. And how can you not see that and have it stick with you? And so I always wanted to know, does that stuff actually happen? And I don't mean from a scientist. I wanted to hear it from an exorcist, from a priest that may have been in the know, the inner circle, to give me any of that private info. I went to college at a Catholic-sponsored university outside of Chicago. And there was a Benedictine monastery associated with this college. And we would every so often talk to these monks, and it was pretty cool. They were very, very hip, very forthcoming, and they would answer questions, pointed questions. And they knew, even in college, I was doing some research and studying in this area, just parapsychology and religious experience. So they probably were expecting me at some point to ask about that. But I asked them, what can you tell me about demonic possession? Have you ever seen any secret documents at the Vatican? Have you heard stories? Have you participated in an exorcism? And they all got quiet, and they all kind of looked at one of the monks. And one of the monks spoke up and to say, all I'll say about it is this, Jim. Here's all I have to say. I was privy to an exorcism at one point early in my career. And I wasn't taking part in the exorcism as part of a ritual. I was just an observer, we'll call it that. And he remembers that the exorcist had a briefcase which contained paperwork that was used, ritual books, some other paraphernalia, and that they were doing this exorcism. And the exorcist then leaves. And this monk that I was talking to accompanied this other priest, this exorcist person. And they go, and I guess they, debrief. They put the stuff away. And he said, when the exorcist opened up the briefcase, the stuff had been burnt. Everything in the briefcase had been burnt. And he said, so Jim, and this is why I started this segment, this show today, by saying, I don't care where you are on the belief spectrum. I don't care if you're a professional or an amateur. Whatever is the catalyst for at least some sets of these experiences, you cannot take lightly. Because, I have a monk staring me right in the eye saying to me, Jim, everything in this briefcase that we used as part of this ritual was burnt. And so whatever was going on was dangerous. Whether it was coming from the person, whether it was psychokinesis, whether it was a malevolent spirit, whether it was a demonic force, whatever it was dangerous. And the person said, I have no doubt that whatever this was could have hurt us. He took it to mean as a warning, but whatever it was, if it can affect a seasoned, experienced monk, it can hit anybody.
Yeah.
So I say that, and as a skeptic, I'm listening to this story, and I'm like, wow, what? I'm trying to go over every scenario. But the fact is, we do know from some of these cases of diabolical possession and extreme possessive states, whether it's a loved one, whether it's a ancestor, whether it's some other cosmic spirit, whatever it is, that sometimes physical phenomena also accompanies it. It's not just a personal, subjective experience. Sometimes there are objective events that are going on in the environment that tell you whatever it is, it's more than just dissociation itself.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a great way for us, to wrap up this last segment, is to talk about, well, what about parapsychological effects? But I agree with you 100%, because in my own personal experience, again, I can't tell you for sure, and I'm someone that likes to apply science and debunking. But in the experiences I've had with a legitimate quote unquote possession, whether it was psychological or whether it was spiritual, it did contain physical violence. It was a highly stressful event. And, frankly, it disturbed all the people involved for almost a year following the incident. So, again, I need to emphasize that, this sort of stuff is not for the lighthearted and certainly not for amateurs.
And
Because
probably shouldn't be something that people try to invite to have happen.
no.
I know we also know, I'm not going to name the spot, the spot, but
Yeah.
we've also heard from one popular ghost hunting location that, again, groups have come in, independent groups, where a member of the group, without knowing any of this kind of background we're talking about today, without knowing what's happened with other groups, there was a very strong dissociative, possessive type of experience that happened that was traumatic. And so this stuff occurs, and I wish we had more information so we could at least try to anticipate, to warn people, to try to control for this to some extent, because we certainly want to encourage citizen science and good field research. But it looks like this is a risk factor that we all should know is there. And until we get more information, people should, again, treat this with absolute kid gloves. Do not mess around with this.
Yeah, and to add to what you just brought up, in the cases that we were talking about in that location, these people went into basically unconscious trances for extended periods. And of course, the people on site did the right thing. They called an ambulance.
Right.
It's which is what you should do, because it might be possession, or maybe someone's having going into a blood sugar coma. Either or, right? Things just got very serious. But no, related on that vein, and in being honest with my background and yours too, which is, one of the things I think we're both saying is, when you're in the moment of these kind of things, we don't care what your beliefs are. It can be dangerous and very confusing and creepy. Right. Sometimes it doesn't matter why or how we justify or explain things. When you're in the middle of it, right, it's a very different game. But what about that? That's kind of our other point. We can talk about possession as, just psychology or spirit intrusion, but we do have to add that spooky component, which is, what about phenomena? What about psychokinesis? What about seeing apparitions in conjunction with possession? What about weird knowledge that they shouldn't have? And that's really always been my guiding rule with a case like that. Well, someone says they're possessed. Well, okay, have you seen the dresser float by itself? Are there witnesses to to phenomena above and beyond them claiming being taken over by an individual? And I think that's a real good line to draw in terms of, should this just be considered primarily psychological, or maybe could it be, or should it be considered something more? What are your thoughts on that?
I kind of like Occam's razor, right? When all things being said and all things equal, the simplest explanation is usually not just the best, but it's usually correct. So I tend to think of, look, the way I approach possession is the same way I would approach any unexplained phenomena. I take it seriously, but I don't take it at face value. I also don't take it lightly. So I think if an experience is happening that looks like possession, you should realize that, okay, yes, psychology, conventional psychology knows that there are phenomena that are dissociative in nature that certainly resemble what this looks like here. And maybe that's all it is. And even if it's all that it is, that's still significant, because dissociative phenomena, the more extreme forms, are rare. They can get dramatic. So you shouldn't minimize that at all. But yes, if a psychiatric or psychological explanation can probably cover it, that's probably a good starting point. But when you start seeing other things come into play, where other people are affected, there are other psychosomatic complaints that you can verify, cuts, scratches, bruises. When people start seeing to have the psychokinetic or PK poltergeist kind of stuff in conjunction with it, or there's other signs of parapsychological activity. Someone speaks in languages that apparently they don't know, or they're giving information they shouldn't have, or if a voice is coming out that doesn't match the person's. That's where you have to wonder, where does the limits of human capabilities end and paranormal abilities or forces start? I don't know, and I think the human mind is tremendously vast, and it's a universe we haven't even scratched the surface of yet. So I leave a big, door open on that of what this all could be. But it screams for more research. The conundrum is the people that go after that research have to be extremely cautious, and it shouldn't just be citizen scientists, and it's not going to be me.
Yeah, well, see, I probably would tackle it, but I think you're absolutely right. This might be kind of the most dangerous animal to hunt when it comes, kind of to layperson field science, because again, referring back to the situation I was in, my every instinct when I was in the middle of that, being a psychologist, was something is not right here. And it's very hard not to get absorbed in it. And it's very hard also not to get very perturbed by it. There were some fairly decent signs of information transferal without contact. In the case that I looked at, the person was able to correctly respond to Latin phrases, not having a lick of Latin background. And again, could any of that be explained by alternate means? Yes. But again, when you're in the field in the middle of it, it is creepy as hell.
Oh, it is. It is. Even when you're talking about mundane stuff, like at the Southbridge Vault, someone just becoming absorbed and going in sort of like a catatonic state. Because both in that situation and the one where the guy turns from Jekyll to Hyde, just observing it, and you're just, within a foot of these people, you have this distinct sense that they're not there. I don't know where they are, but they're not here.
Yep.
And it's something visceral that you're dealing with something outside of anything that's normal. I don't care whether it's psychology or something else. This is not normal, and Elvis has left the building.
And to this day, I can still see that person's face while they were in that state, and just having this absolute knowledge of, I am not talking to the same person I was a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
And that is a very interesting experience to have.
Did you, by the way, did you record that? Did you guys happen to have any of that on tape? Or
I'm going to be honest and say that was not only completely unplanned, but such a crisis that no, we didn't have it recorded. And I have to be honest, I'm kind of thankful for it, if nothing else, for the person's privacy, because things got, I don't have a better word for it, so woo-woo that I wasn't really sure I felt comfortable or the people involved would feel comfortable having a formal record. There's some out there, and if I was really, really pushed and wanted to relive that, I could probably dig up a fair amount of recording and records. But in terms of direct filming, I purposefully kind of vetoed that when things started getting serious, because I wasn't sure if that was going to end up being ethical.
Oh, no, totally understandable. Totally. But I know it's easy. Anyone can go to YouTube, right, or Vimeo, and type in possession states, and you're going to see all sorts of footage from all sorts of sources. And this is where I would say, everyone, put your skeptic hat on when you're seeing this, because this stuff is very rare. And we do know that there are instances that seem to be, what you want to say, legit, meaning it spontaneously happens. It's not fraud. It doesn't seem to be obvious mental illness. We know the Catholic Church and probably other religions do private investigations and monitoring of this stuff. And they have their own checklist and system to try to decide whether something could truly be diabolical, or whether this is most likely a psychiatric kind of case. So there clearly is room for doubt. There's room for discovery. But everyone should be very skeptical if you see anything like this just on YouTube, because it is so rare, so dramatic. And what, let's say, legitimate evidence there probably is, it's probably kept, like you're saying, Brian, it's confidential, if it exists.
It's in the vaults. God, I want to get to those vaults.
What vaults? What vaults?
Yeah, exactly. But there are vaults. And on a final closing note, before we wrap up the show, guys, another reason getting professionals involved is there are fraudsters out there. There are some people with certain tendencies in mental illness that will enjoy putting on a very, very dastardly show just for attention. I'm not saying that's all cases, but normally I'm kind of anti-fraud in a lot of cases. But people will sometimes play make 'em up for attention, and you need someone trained with that sort of experience in spotting that. In some ways of knowing whether or not you're going along for a very complicated ride, and sometimes you may never know in some of these instances. Any
What a
last thought?
downer.
Yeah,
But yeah, one last thought. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Yep. Happy Halloween, everybody. We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening in, and stay tuned next week for more practical parapsychology.